Welcome to the MHA webinar series. This is on optimizing the work from home experience. My name is Richard Long. I have been with MHA for a number of years, but we're glad to have everyone on and hope there's some information here that you will find useful. Just as a note, this is if you're not familiar with who MHA is. MHA has been around for about 20 years, but this is our client pedigree. You can see we go across all of the different verticals and a lot of well-known organizations, both large and small. So I think we've got a pretty good experience across the various verticals within the business continuity and disaster recovery realm. This is both me and the company, right? As I said, we've been around for about 20 years doing best practices as it relates to business continuity, disaster recovery. Our goal is to really make sure that what we're doing is functional for organizations that we work with, that this isn't just checking a box for audit purposes or anything else. Well, that's an important part of making sure that we're compliant. It's really about functional capability. So we really want to try to ensure that what is out there will be useful as opposed to just a bunch of documents or collateral that's looked at once a year and then just put back on the shelf. We do have some online tools for some self-service and some self-management that we think works very well. Those started out really as tools that we started using in our consulting practice and have rolled that out to other organizations. So if that's something you're interested in, please feel free to reach out. But as you can see, I've been with MHA for about 15 years, come from a retail and manufacturing and distribution background, and have been around IT for quite a long time, well over 20 years. I'll just leave it at that. So today, as we talk about the work from home experience, we've really got these 5 different areas that we want to talk about, which is kind of the technology, security, physical, coping with responsibilities, and communication and social. And as we get started, I've got just a little preview. I'd like to make sure we understand. This will be a little bit different than some of the other webinars that we at MHA, especially on the technology side or the DR side of things, or even business continuity side. We're going to talk about some of the specific technologies and business continuity aspects, but also we're going to spend some time really talking about people. One of the things that we feel is very important, again, talking in terms of functional recovery, functional continuity, functional planning, is it really is important that we remember that people are ultimately what make up a lot of our organizations. And while as a technologist, as an IT person, I focus a lot on technology, but in kind of that spirit of, in that spirit of, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around, does it make a sound? In a similar fashion, if a lot of our technology or a lot of our processes, if people aren't there to do them, are they really functional and are they really necessary? And so as we start thinking about risks and business continuity and what we need, I think understanding what people are doing and how they're doing it is absolutely key. Because in the end, one of the things that I think we'll see here is that human error is sometimes some of the biggest issues that we have. So just kind of with that preparation and with that kind of that big picture is really, where overall practices and habits and things that we do in an organization ensure that we can continue and rely on. And one of those things are our people, not just our technology and processes. We like to look at things in terms of risk versus reliance versus all of the other pieces. And so where is that balance that as we look at things? And sometimes we tend to focus on our processes and other things. So kind of as we're talking about through all of this, kind of think about in your own organization, what is it that you're doing that might be a bit more work from home related as it relates to people and or the processes, as opposed to just the business continuity, business process aspect that's going on, or the technology aspect, but how the people interrelate to that, because often those are some of our biggest risks. So as we talk through that a little bit, as we've seen, the issues that we see in terms of crises, a lot of these things, if you look through them, really are human related, right? Mismanagement, discrimination, crime, whistleblowers, things like that are related to our people, as opposed to catastrophes, or lawsuits or things like that, or cyber. So kind of understanding that. The other important part of that is a lot of these things are most of the crises that occur are related to smoldering types of issues. And I think today, some of the things we're going to talk about could be considered one of those smoldering issues, as opposed to those sudden, right? Those smoldering issues are those things that, everybody kind of knows is going on, but hopes they will go away. Or we're doing little things here and there to try to prevent them, but not really focusing on it. Really just kind of hoping it'll ultimately finish. And then when a crisis comes up, everybody looks at it and says, yeah, we've known about it. We just didn't do anything. And so I think, as business continuity professionals and what we're thinking about from a resiliency perspective is those smoldering types of issues and getting ahead of them, even if it doesn't necessarily raise ourselves up. I think sometimes as business continuity and DR folks, we're really good at reacting. We're sometimes not quite as good at really making sure that those things don't happen and our preparations are in place just in case. So just a couple of comments as we kind of get started here. These quotes I think are very helpful. I like all of them, but one of the things is we spend time on those things that are urgent and not enough time on what is important. It gets back to that reaction versus preparation from Covey. And then Jason Fried, who's a speaker. If you haven't heard him, he's got some good talks both on TED and other places. But we get that idea that office is 9 to 5 in cubicles, right? And then it's no wonder that most of us who are employed inside that model haven't considered other options or resist the idea that it could be different. I think we've kind of been forced to that with our current environment, with the COVID, the pandemic, working from home and other things like that. We've started to look outside of it, but to a certain extent, we've still kind of kept that 9 to 5. Here's how we work in a cubicle, but here's how we do it at home, versus really looking at what are a bunch of different options and how we do that. We're not focusing on that today, but hopefully maybe that's an idea for you to consider. And then lastly, just this idea of, as we're thinking about people, is we need to take time away from work, right? Look at other things. I was told very early on, I had a teacher both in high school and college that would look at me and say, you know what, Rich, you really need to go out and smell the flowers. You're missing out on a lot. And I think that sometimes is the case. So there's some kind of basic concepts that we're going to talk through in general across the board. But again, thinking in terms of people and making sure that our people are prepared so that they don't necessarily make errors, or they're as efficient as they can be, which then hopefully prevents us from having to leverage some of our business continuity plans and activities, right? Ideally, we never have to do it. I happen to study a certain martial art called Aikido. And one of the principles there is it's reactionary in the sense of it's not an attacking type of martial art. You try to diffuse and use people's energies against them. But one of the key focuses is the ultimate technique in Aikido is being aware of your surroundings, and prior to anything happening, cross the street if there's a potential issue or conflict that would occur. That's the ultimate technique. Prevent something from happening. And then if you have to react, that's fine. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to think about here are the things that we can prevent or ensure that people are prepared to work as necessary. But a lot of these things I think we'll see both on a technology is something from a business continuity perspective that it may not be your direct responsibility, but maybe something you want to start asking or thinking about in your planning and in your interactions with all of the other departments that you talk to, whether it be HR, IT, and some of the other business units, to ask about how this is being done for their employees, because it does have that resiliency need. And so as you think about all of these concepts, these are not necessarily about you. You might want to use them for your own personal use, but hopefully take some of these concepts and go out and use them in your discussions, in your planning, in your risk assessments, is really what this is intended to be. So as we think about some of these, and some of this may have been items that have already been considered and done, but a lot of what we focus on is work, and so some of the things we're going to be talking about is home, and are people doing these things? And so it may be in some of your plans or in some of your interactions, you're encouraging the appropriate teams responsible for communicating to ensure that this kind of training or information is being shared. But as you can kind of see here, it's trying to separate, as if possible, home space and workspace, right? We're so used to leaving and going to the office and things like that. When we're working at home, that doesn't always happen, right? The idea of home also is come home from work. One of the things I think that we are seeing is people are working more and more. We've got that flexibility. I've been working from home for, like I said, about 15 years. And in fact, my family says, you know, dad or whoever, seems like you do two things. You work, you exercise, and then you go down and eat, and then you go work some more. Well, it's convenient for me because all I have to do is go into my office and I'm always doing something. So kind of that idea of maybe coming home from work, if you will, taking care of yourself, setting a schedule, and then having that break room type of thing so that, you know, you can get away from work like we have, you know, in the office. It kind of goes against what I was just saying in terms of thinking outside of the box of kind of putting our cubicle. A lot of this is virtual types of things, you know, being able to take that break away from what we do for work. And then from a work perspective, making sure that our technology is different, right? There's home technology and there's work technology. And in today's world, you know, it probably makes a lot of sense to potentially keep those separate where possible. At least whether it's logically, you know, virtually, or even if it's physical. But understanding that work is work and home is home, and we'll talk about some of the risks there. Again, that opposite idea of go to the office versus coming home, right? I'm going to work. I'm going to do that. Kind of break that mindset sometimes is helpful. Again, taking breaks, we talked about that. The proper technology and security and making sure that's always being reviewed and updated. Communication rules and interaction rules for those that are at home. I know that most of us have become very used to dogs barking in the background. There's not much we can do about that. We've become tolerant. That's okay. But there are other things that, you know, we want to make sure that are in place that people that are at home may not remember when we're working. Oh, well, you're just working at home, like we were when we were working after hours. You know, I could be interrupted, but in the middle of the day, maybe that's not the right thing to do. And then lastly, making sure that there is that constant interaction. Some of the things that we've been looking at and studying show that, you know, that's one thing that while we have become a virtually communicative society with our handheld devices and end devices, there are still people that are missing out on that face-to-face interaction, and it's more than just a Zoom call or a text. So we need to think about those things as well. So this is kind of the idea from a technology perspective when we think in terms of what technology do people need to have, right? And it's more than just tools, but it's also kind of those concepts of space as well as support. And so we'll talk about these various things. But as you can see, all of this is in place, right? From support to the network to devices, laptops, desktops, phones, you know, video because of the meetings that we have and being able to see people and at least get some of those facial interactions and body language as best as possible, appropriate speakers, and then access. You know, it's one thing to have the technology, it's another thing to be able to get to it. I was just speaking with Catherine, who's on here, our MHA colleague, and was saying that it took a family member of hers a week to finally get access to the technology and the applications that she needed. Because of certain technology restrictions that people weren't familiar with or they weren't aware she was using. And so that can really have an impact. Again, we talked about kind of the separating the work from home idea and then redundancy. We'll talk about that, but one of the things to consider there is, you know, as we're starting to work at home, the redundancy that may be in place at the office is not in place at home. Right, because it's home. I don't have, you know, redundant networks. I don't have extra hardware that I can go get. If something breaks, I'm stuck. So all of these things are an important part of the technology. So let's think about a bit more detail here. And I should have said up front, and I apologize for that. If you do have any questions, feel free to use the chat feature. Also, feel free to just chime in. We're very much okay with interruptions, if you will, and questions, but we do have the chat up. So if you have a question, want to ask about that or a comment, please feel free to do so. But as we think about the technology and access from a technology perspective, one is ensuring that communication goes out, that there is plenty of capacity and bandwidth. One of the things that I have noticed in my personal, everything was fine until everybody started working at home. My spouse is doing more at work, even though she does not work outside the home in a traditional job. She has other things going on, whether that's now doing more Zoom meetings or other meetings with the family while I'm working. We had a college-age son that was still here, so now he's working on school things at home. And so our bandwidth, even though we had plenty, we started seeing at times it getting sucked up because the people who weren't working were now streaming on all the devices, and I'm trying to work. So that whole idea of, is there enough capacity for everything that's going on, from work to school to TV, for voice, et cetera, that's going on? People don't necessarily have not built their home networks to do that. So understanding what are those minimal needs, what are they doing, and help them understand how to prioritize. Support when issues arise. Here's a big piece. There's one thing to be able to call the support center when there's an issue, when you're at work, or if there's an application or other technology issue. It's another thing to now say, my internet provider is having a problem, right? And what is the problem? Is the problem the home network? Is the problem the access that's going on at home, or is the problem really a work issue? So now, do people understand who to call and how to do that? Because they typically haven't had to do that in the past. And that troubleshooting becomes more difficult. So one of the things here is does your support desk understand, and can they support that, or do they just kick that off and say, not our problem, you got to go call your personal internet provider, or we don't support the desktops that you're using because you're using your home if you were using a company laptop. So those support issues are very important to address, to make comfortable for everyone else. One of the things as an IT person that I often see is sometimes the IT folks think the issues are basic and everybody should know it, but it isn't the case. People are not necessarily technology savvy. They know exactly how to run their business, they know how to do their functions, but when it comes to some of these, what would be considered obvious technology impact, they don't understand is that I just can't get to what I need to. It must be an access issue, when it turns out it's on their network side, and helping people troubleshoot those through. The last thing would be, and this falls within some security, but as we talk technology, is firewalls. Sometimes, by today's standards, most everything that people have has a firewall installed normally, and it's usually on by default because companies are trying to do that specifically. But you work with people who might have had the same router for 10 years. They just never upgraded it. They've never had a firewall on it, or the firewall's not on their laptop. To protect the information that's going on in the home. There's firewalls and security as you're logging in, whether you're using VPNs and those kind of things that we'll talk about from an access perspective. But what's happening at individuals' home, and has that been addressed? How, and then the help on how to do that. This goes back to the help desk perspective. It's gone from supporting a single environment to supporting however many employees you have, hundreds, thousands, that are going to be potentially different because of how they're set up between the various internet providers, the various devices that are being used, et cetera. So something to consider, because that security side is becoming more and more critical on the home side, because if a hacker or a malicious actor comes in, they still might be able to get to your information from a work perspective. And then the second one is access. How are people accessing those resources, and are those in that information well understood, documented, and communicated? As we were talking about, that example with Catherine's family member, it was understood that it was straightforward and everything should have worked, but it turned out all of the assumptions were wrong, and so it went from we're troubleshooting one person to now we have to set up an entire virtual desktop infrastructure for the rest of the company because some of those things weren't thought out. Now, those are examples of things that have happened over the recent past, but as this continues and people keep going back and forth, which will probably happen from going to the office and going to work from home and et cetera, these access issues and the information is important. So is this a VPN access environment? Do you just use a VPN, which is a direct private connection to work to access those applications, but you don't need to do that for cloud-based applications, SaaS solutions like Microsoft 365, or Salesforce, or some of those other things that can be done just directly from the internet. Or to make it easy, do you enforce that everyone goes through VPN? What is really the right solution? As well as those things that are local on people's devices. Are you allowing people to download data and then use client-based applications that aren't talking to the corporate network, for example? All of that, when it's in the office and it's all consolidated, is one thing. People just get on and work. Now at home, it's, well, I have to VPN for this, but I don't have to VPN for this. And so they get used to not doing that. And the next thing you know, you're getting a phone call because somebody says, I can't access our ERP system. Well, are you VPN'd in? Well, no, because I haven't had to VPN in for a week. Well, because they haven't used it. And so all of those efficiency issues and then, potential, problems or, can occur. And then lastly, sharing of documents. One of the things that, that we see is with people at home, people are doing, they're now maybe sharing documents with themselves. I don't want to get onto the VPN to get onto my shared drive. I can just put that onto Box or on my personal Google Drive, right? And then I can share that and send that link to a colleague, and we don't have to worry about getting on VPN. Well, that's also a security issue that that we'll talk about. But how are you doing that? What are the appropriate restrictions and not allowing folks and educating, because you really can't stop some of that unless you're just completely preventing any kind of work outside of your corporate network. So again, important things that from a data and a mistake perspective are important to make sure that people can do. Some of these are more efficiency issues, and it removes frustration. We're working with a client that's migrating away from shared drives to the Microsoft 365 tools. Well, a lot of the processes that are associated with that are so tied to what they do with shared drive. Moving to the online tool is requiring a change management issue. So all of these things need to be considered, as part of helping people work at home efficiently, because their work process is going to be different for each individual. And now working at home, that's all being upended. So all of those considerations should be considered, and work with your appropriate IT, folks to understand that and roll those things out. Devices. So as you consider it, and again, a lot of this has been addressed, but may not have been addressed for the long term. And so we just really want to remind about a lot of these things. Is really desktop, laptop, work provided versus personal. One of the recommendations that we have is, if you're not using a virtual desktop, it probably makes some sense to have people invested in a work laptop. Again, the idea of separate work from home, and not mixing information and data. Because if somebody takes their personal laptop, they've downloaded data, they take their personal laptop over to an engagement or to a party or to something else, your work information is now getting out to the public, which you don't want, as opposed to, the rule is that's the work laptop, it doesn't leave your home, for work or for any other activities, and it's not used for personal access. It requires training and all of that, but something to consider there. Plus then, when the ability to maintain, support, update that laptop can be controlled from a corporate perspective, which is much more difficult when it's a personal device, with the exception of if everything was a cloud-based solution, which is not the case in most organizations. Maybe a personal device is okay, but really consider the work desktops and not necessarily using a remote in. One of the things we've seen some organizations is they've remoted into their desktop at work through their personal device. That is a potential solution for that. Sometimes it's not the most efficient, but it at least simulates what you're doing at work, and so now all that control is there. So that's another option. We talked about the support issues, right? Internet provider, work support. All of this goes into the device issue, right? If it's a single device, you know how to support it. If it's a personal device now, it's Dell to HP to pick your favorite, desktop or laptop with a different operating system and a different patch level, and all of those things become much more difficult for the support team to deal with. And then we've already kind of talked about the security. Make sure that firewalls are on your device or at least connected to whatever you're doing. And then on the accessory side, this is one area that I think has been not, in some organizations done well, and others really has not been as considered. It's like, here's your laptop, go start working from home. When we start thinking about monitors, right, really separate. Nobody is typically working on a laptop in the office. They've got a big monitor. Haven't always done that for people working at home, or we've just expected them to use what they have. Again, using some examples that I've heard, it's like, well, just connect the monitor that you have to your personal device. Well, now they're having to move from one device to another, and they're having to move the cable around. Or even things like, well, your TV is a monitor, hook it up to the TV, right? Well, that's going to impact some of the other things we're going to talk about from a space perspective, right? People say, you really want me working on my couch in my living room because that's where my TV is. I only have one TV. Or you want me working in my bed? How do I set up a table? Those kind of things. So making sure that we provided for that, especially those people who are used to using dual monitors. It's one thing to work at home for a few days and work on a laptop. It's another thing to be permanently or extendedly at home and trying to do what's normally done on 2 monitors on a laptop monitor or even a single monitor. So those are minor things, but again, errors happen. If you're used to doing your work steps with 2 monitors and now you have to flip between screens, you flip between screens, control tab or however you do it, you hit the wrong screen, you hit the wrong button, you hit save, boom, now data's corrupted, or there's a problem with data and you don't know about it until down the road, and now we start having issues, whether it be customer service, vendor, and the overall efficiency goes way down. And I think the same things sit for these other considerations, right? They pop in and out, but not necessarily for always participating, especially as it relates to microphones. Computer microphones are great, but they're not as sensitive. We're finding headphones and other things. And on top of that, I would say making sure that there's backup technology for that. We talk about that here in a second as well. And then the video camera, if that's probably something separate that if used regularly and angles. One of the things I've noticed is for those that are using their laptop video versus a standard one is you get the strange angles, right? You're looking up somebody's nose, or you're looking down at something, and or you're seeing more of their background than you are really seeing them, and so leveraging that and making sure that what we're seeing is the person, and we're not being distracted by all of the other activities. And I think I'll just make an initial note here as you're working with folks is making sure that distractions aren't occurring, right? We've heard numerous news reports of, a certain prominent journalist, right, had lost his job due to, inappropriate meeting etiquette. And some of that, is just, well, that's just crazy. Why would somebody do that? But there could be inadvertent things that are people not used to. So, we'll talk about that meeting etiquette, but helping with that technology to make sure that that's not a distraction, that it's as easy as you. So when somebody sits down, it turns on and it's right at their head. It's not, all over the place, and they have to move their monitor or their screen around because of the video. There's something to consider. Again, it just makes things easier. Support. We've talked about a little bit about that, but again, really important. What is the role of the service desk, the work service desk? Communicate that to the role, right? You're not there to do their personal work necessarily, or maybe you are. Here's the scope of that, so they understand who to call for when. And again, with individuals, helping them identify what's a work issue versus a home issue, right? And that idea of they're not tech savvy. Don't assume that that it's obvious, because it isn't obvious. Even for me, sometimes I'll do something and I'll reach out to a colleague and I'll say, hey, I can't do this. And they'll just kind of go, seriously? And then they'll say what it is, and I'll be like, oh, you're right. I should have known that. But I was distracted, or I was busy, or I wasn't thinking, right? So that's going to be the same for individuals. They need to understand those distinctions, who to contact for each type of issue, and having a cheat sheet can be very helpful for people, so they can look at it and say, oh, it's this issue, this is who I call. Oh, it's this issue, this is who I call. Otherwise, you're probably going to get it to the help desk all the time. Redundancy. One of the things that I've seen is, again, the idea of using multiple tools. If within your organization, it might be standardized, but one of the things that we see, at least as consultants, is I'm probably on 4 different collaboration tools every single day. And so that now ends up impacting my technology, because a mic doesn't come back on correctly, or it's taking control of it, and I go to my next, I go to Skype, or I go to WebEx, or I go to Teams, and something's going wrong there because it gets conflicted. So understanding that, but making sure just the basics, right? Having a phone and a computer, that redundancy of what happens if the internet connection isn't sufficient enough, you don't have enough bandwidth for voice and video. Well, shut your video down first, potentially, if that's appropriate, or call in on your phone, making sure people have that ability, as well as how to mute. I mean, I think that's one of the funniest things. Is I was saying something that one of the biggest phrases today is, I think you're on mute, or you're on mute, or how much time in meetings are we spending? Hey, you're on mute. So helping people understand how to use the technologies really is important. They're intuitive, but sometimes they're not as intuitive, especially if you're using different ones all the time. I was just on that the other day. I was on mute because I forgot that that tool always puts me on mute, whereas the ones I've been using all day, by default, it was on. And again, what happens if the internet's down? Do people know how to use their phone to get to critical meetings and to use the tools? Are the tools on their phone? Can you use WebEx or Teams on your phone if it's needed, or is it just going to be a voice call in? And then we've talked about laptop, desktop issues, right? Communication on the outside parties to help, etc. So from a security perspective, like we talked about, this is more than just a technology issue, right? So in all cases, right, there's personal, there's technology, there's home, and there's data. So personal and home. One of the things that we do think is something to consider from a continuity perspective, because if you lose important people, that's going to impact your ability to work. But think about safety of the staff while they're at home, right? One of the things that's happening is there are more and more people at home, and threat actors or bad criminals are understand that, and so really people need to remember that at home they don't have that additional security that they may have at work, and so they need to be vigilant and not necessarily be distracted because of work when something else is happening. So it's really the same time as anything is taking that into account depending on where you're at and what you're doing, right? But we're reminding folks, right? Keep your doors locked. Don't answer if you're not expecting a visitor, right? Go ahead and work. Just because somebody comes to the door, if you were at work in the office, you wouldn't be answering the door, right? Now, if you're expecting someone, great. But if you're not, there's no reason to get up and go to the door necessarily. If it's packages and things like that you're worried about, right? Well, we get alerts for that the package has been delivered. Great. Now you can go down and pick it up. But there's no reason to be entering that. We have seen where people are being attacked, or there's some risk because people know they're home, and so they can knock and people will answer. Also, making sure that management has a way to know if something is going on, for people to know this is how you can communicate if there's an issue, right? Whether that's through normal communications or not. Some people may not think about, hey, I've had an issue at home, or there's an issue, or they may have a safety problem. They can't get a hold of someone else, and they need to let somebody at the office know that there's a potential safety issue. How do they do that without necessarily calling, sending an email, or what is the protocol for that? Could be really important. Again, we've talked about the training. All of these are about training and providing concepts on what people need to do that they may not be thinking about. The other thing is social media. This goes across everything. You're using social media for sharing information about the company, what you're doing, but also if people start thinking about, they're posting and saying, yep, working at home, been at home all by myself for the last week, all the family's gone. That's risky, right? Because now because we know that information get out. So again, we're not trying to tell people what to do, but just make sure people are aware of their safety. And if somebody knows they're going to be away, or they're going to be home alone for an extended period of time, it's probably not the wisest thing to do. We've talked a lot about the network side, firewalls, VPN access, et cetera. So I'm not going to emphasize, but I just remind that is a security issue that needs to be addressed and continued. But one of the things I think that's important, again, is limiting that personal device like we talked about, and ensure that any device that anybody is using has some kind of encrypted and can be remotely cleansed. So if you're going to let people use their personal laptops, you want to make sure that you're ensuring that they're keeping those encrypted. So if those are lost, they can't be used. And even I've known organizations where they say, if we're going to let you use a personal laptop, we need to have the ability to go in and wipe that if it's lost. Otherwise, you can't. We're going to provide your own. But we've talked about using an organization-controlled laptop, but then you can have all of that control, right? There isn't any privacy or other questions for the organization being able to access data. I think from a home perspective and a work, you've got the same data protections are in place. We've talked about that, networks, et cetera. But one of the important things is, just like at the office, is making sure that monitors time out, making sure that there's potentially a security shield. One of the things that is going on, people are working with sensitive data, and if there are other people in the home, they have no business reading some of that information, especially depending on who it is. Whether it's a small child, maybe you're not worried about it, but now we're talking about teenagers and other adults that might be in the home. They're not necessarily doing anything malicious, but now all of a sudden they see private data for customers or private data for vendors, or they see something that they happen to know and that may not be public knowledge about a large company that you work with. And now they see that and they happen to inadvertently share that on social media. It's like, hey, my aunt's working for such and such a company, and they're in the middle of doing this. Well, it's probably not information that wants to be shared. And so understanding that, making sure that that information is not shared or viewed inappropriately. And then continuing or starting a security awareness training, especially around phishing and spear phishing for people, because there are going to be mixing, work and pleasure. Even we've done that all the time, but even more so now, especially if people are using their personal devices to access work. Because if they're on, doing their shopping after hours and they get attacked, well, now they're using that same device for work. There's a risk that they're into the VPN, and now the threat actor has gotten into your network. So that continued cyber training is really, really key. Okay, so this now is more around the people side, and I think again as we talk through these things is understanding that people's workspace, their personal space is now their workspace. And so this may be something that you want to consider with your appropriate HR teams, their managers, however that's being dealt with in your organization to help people understand, here's the best way to work, not just relying on people's natural inclination. There was a long time that I spent work at my kitchen table, partly because it was kind of the necessity of the space that I had, but partly because I just didn't think about it. I was just so focused on work. Then I realized I was not being as productive as I could, and I adjusted my space. So these are the things to consider from a space perspective. And again, these are obvious if you look at them, but there are a lot of folks that don't consider it. And so it is important and helping people understand. But as you can kind of see here, right? At one point, my office was next to our laundry area. And so we had to adjust our schedule because we couldn't do laundry on a Friday or a Thursday because I'm in the middle of meetings and we can't have the washer and dryer that we could hear in that office space coming through. So we changed that, and then I moved my office space and we did all that. So consider where your loud appliances, right, or loud noises going on. If you do need to get away, can you, right? Temperature control, right, or ease of being comfortable, right? Again, don't want people, a lot of this is, again, being distracted because you're hot, you're cold, whatever it is. We talked about a break room. Personalize the space a little bit, for work appropriate, background music, whatever that is. I think a door is really important so that you can at least shut it and understand that I'm now working or I'm busy, right? Even though we didn't have that necessarily in the office, in a home office, that's probably important because of the multiple people that are where. It goes right in line with communicating the ground rules, right? What are the interruptions? If the door is closed, I'm busy, right? Now, obviously emergencies and things, we all understand that's a different animal, right? If something's hurt or there's something going on, we want people to interrupt. But it's those normal urgent things or things that are going on, right? It could be as easy as when the door is closed, I'm not to be interrupted until I open the door, or this is what you have to do. You need to call me, text me, just like if I was at work, right? You're not just walking in to my office space, and some of that goes back to a schedule, right? It might turn around to say, I'm going to be taking breaks on these times and be prepared to. We can then be prepared to have our conversation, outside of whatever emergency might be going on. But I think that idea of kind of using work concepts at home can be really helpful, rather than just assuming that I'm going to interrupt. Just real quickly, just can help people understand the desk and comfort. Is there enough space for people to work, to do their, to have their work papers, to have their laptops, to have their monitors, all of those kind of things, right? Do you need to stand, right? We sit a lot, and so being able to move up and down and continue to work or take a break is going to be important. The keyboard and mouse use, ergonomics, to consider people are working more. Same thing with chairs, and then light. Right, making sure that there's enough light and appropriate light so people aren't distracted. Again, these are kind of a bit more maybe touchy-feely or kind of outside the pure BC realm, but what we're trying to do is help people make sure they understand what is going to keep them comfortable, keep them efficient, and prevent them from making errors. So the various priorities and responsibilities that we have, again, looking at personal and family, right? The whole idea of setting a routine, getting ready for the day, scheduling breaks, staying disciplined, adjusting the work schedule is really important. Make sure that routine is in place as appropriate. We're not saying it has to be the same work routine, but having that balance and understanding what it means. The routine might be I get up early and work from 6 to from 5 to 6 while everybody's getting up, and then I can help with breakfast, and then I can sit back down and do my thing, as opposed to trying to think in terms of I get up at 7, the kids are running around while I'm trying to get some emails done, and that's not working. So understanding that, individually, again, defining that person, work, and space, right? Your office versus students versus family space. You may have to transform things, right? People may have to help understand it because they just don't have a large enough space, right? For those that are in apartments or et cetera. But think about that. I'm transforming this from my family space to my workspace. I'm now at work. Now I'm going to transform this back to family space while I'm doing lunch or I'm doing something else. That's okay, but I think it helps that mind shift. But organizations also need to understand the personal situation, right? Understand that situation at home. We're having people work at home and they happen to work in a small apartment. It's going to be a little different than somebody who's in a large home where they have a dedicated office space. Maybe they have two. I've seen some of that where it's like they have their combined office space where everybody gets together and does their work, and then there's my actual office that I do my actual job work in. But understanding what those differences are, we still have to. We can set expectations, but those distractions need to be understood to help people in their management of time. They need these suggestions to be more efficient or to prevent distractions and issues. I think that's part of what our organization needs to understand. That idea of we're no longer in a 9-to-5 cubicle. We're in a work environment that we need to understand. And then helping people understand for self-care, right? Eat well, exercise, take time for yourself, continue what you're doing. Don't let work completely envelop what you're doing, because it's convenient. Again, we know that people should take vacations. People do need to take breaks. When they don't, that's when errors and that's when issues occur. Adjusting work processes, right? Now that we're talking about what happens from a work perspective, virtual doesn't mean that same cadence or that same schedule for meetings and work and everything else. Some people may be working later, earlier, et cetera, and so we have to adjust some of that. So, a different schedule will imply different dependencies in how we do things. Again, expectations, really set those. I think we can say quality and output don't change, but how they're accomplished may be, or when they're accomplished may be, right? It may be that you're getting deliverables at the start of the day, or versus by the end of the day, I need this. Well, somebody's end of the day, because of issues that are going on, maybe 11 o'clock at night. So really, it's, I need to have this when I walk in by 8 a.m. tomorrow, as opposed to I need it by 5 p.m., right? And then making sure that communication and expectations for both meetings and virtual collaboration is understood. There's kind of natural, but I'm not sure in all cases the expectations have been set, right? In these type of meetings, we don't expect to hear a dog, right? You need to find a space that it is quiet because it's of a certain nature that we can't do that. In other cases, that's fine. Or, we do want to have video on as possible, right? So make sure that you're dressed appropriately, at least from the waist up. Those kind of things would be very helpful to folks so they understand. We talked about flexibility in hours for supporting modified schedules. That's going to be really important for organizations, especially as we start seeing more and more people working from different locations, right? They're no longer in maybe the headquarters city or state. They're elsewhere, and they may need to adjust that schedule. And I think management modifications are a key. This is really going to be important for business continuity and understanding things as well. How do you remotely manage a team? That's very different than managing a team that's always there. Updates will be more virtual and potentially less immediate, right? It might be an email, or it might be, a check-in within the application or within some type of workflow. It's not going to necessarily be a drive-by, nor can it be. One of the things that we've seen from a management and a time perspective is people's days are completely jammed with meetings because everybody's scheduling a Zoom meeting or a collaboration meeting, as opposed to drive-bys. We don't have those drive-bys anymore. So understanding how management is going to do that is going to be important. And management is going to really have to adjust how their schedule and their ability to monitor work, right? More on that, deliverable. It might be that they won't have as much of that immediate gratification of, I have that answer now. They have to wait. I've seen that as we work, with colleagues. It's, we'll be sending over for a status and realize I may not get that status until tomorrow morning. I've got to plan my schedule so that I can build that type of time in so that we can still meet our deliverables and be efficient. And really the last thing that we have here is kind of communication and that social connection, right? As you can see, more often, more transparent is really, really key. Now that's going to mean using multiple types of technologies and activities, right? It might be emails and quick conversations during the virtual meetings, or having your drive-by elsewhere. One of the things that has been discussed and I've kind of used a little bit is virtual water cooler, right? You have this space that's set up where people can just go in and see who's there and chat, just like they would if they were walking down the hall, to the restroom or to the water, to the break room. You see somebody you haven't talked to. So people can jump in there for 5 minutes during their break and see who's there and chat and catch up, can be really helpful. Scheduling reminders for people to actually reach out and do things. That's one thing I have found useful personally, right? Because if I just think about it, it's like, oh, I should contact that person. The next thing you know, I'm struggling or I'm distracted and I haven't done it all day, as opposed to scheduling that to say, you know what, I know I have to reach out to these 5 people. I'm going to schedule that on my calendar, at least a reminder to say, reach out to this team member, or I need to contact so-and-so. And then it comes up, it's an activity. I'm distracted in the sense of I'm reminded to do it, so I can stop what I do or at least pause it and say I can do that in 5 more minutes after I finish this task. Those type of things that can be helpful, again, because we're not seeing that as naturally. I'm not seeing John twice a day because he's running down the hall and I can wave him over, right? And we talked about that, a little bit of the multiple methods, right? Emails, texts, virtual calls, actual phone calls, the social media, the chats. All of those need to be used to communicate and continue that social interaction. And as we move to in and out of some of our ability to meet face to face, maybe there are those times that you want to get people into the office. So teams may want to consider, leveraging some of the bigger conference room, for example, if people are still in the office, and say, hey, we want to have a team meeting. We're going to remain socially distanced, or we're going to bring in half this week and half next week. Kind of be creative in how people are interacting and encouraging that. It's harder. For me, it's harder to try to really feel comfortable having a social interaction on collaboration meetings, whether it be Zoom or anything else. But I'm learning, and it's a lot better than none. And so I think that's something else to consider. While it might not be perfect, it at least helps us get there. So lastly, and then if there are any questions, please shoot out. But we've kind of talked about, we want to make sure we have technology. We want to make it secure, both technologically and personal, making sure that we're helping people take care of themselves, ensure that data is protected, that's being displayed in our workspaces, that it is a comfortable workspace. We know there's going to be competing priorities. We need to adjust. We need to be flexible to that. And then we need to, try to help people understand the various ways to interact with each other. That's what we have. Again, might be a little bit different than what we've talked about. Hopefully it's giving you some things to think about, to take off, and look at your business continuity plans. How is these work at home activities impacting business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans, people working remotely, as opposed to just, well, they're there, it's all working fine, but really digging into what some of these differences are, and working with folks. Question, that is out there is, do we think there'll be a renewed interest in, or the importance of BYOD, right? In policies, all of those type of things. And yes, one of the issues there is really the security around BYOD. We've done a lot, but I've also seen companies start to restrict that back a little bit, where it's just not everybody bring what they want and we're going to put it on there. It's really, to a certain extent, coming back to corporate or company provided devices. But those policies, and especially as we talked about how to wipe data or how to keep that secure, really is something the policies and procedures need to be reviewed and updated, as well as in your business continuity plans, or does that, or those for the most part is how are people using those and what happens if, right? Because that actually could be a crisis event now. Somebody's key device is now out in the public. Is there information on there that could be used to harm the organization? Anybody else have any other questions or insights? One of the nice things here is if somebody has some interesting experience or successes that they've seen, it's always helpful to share that. One other thing to consider, I think that's come up here is that the e-discovery side of your data protection, right, is what could that do to people's devices? So if they've downloaded information on their device, what would happen if there's a litigation hold? Now somebody's personal device may be required to be put on hold or taken. And so that idea of not keeping data on personal devices outside of company provided devices really is a key piece to remind people about. People don't think about that until all of a sudden somebody's knocking at the door saying, we know you're keeping information. That's part of a litigation. I need your laptop. Because you can't now delete it. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? We will provide this hopefully to you so that you can pull it out, use some of the information. But if there aren't any other questions, we, like I said, wanted to get you out of here to give you some time to go to your next meeting or take care of what you need to. But we appreciate very much you taking the time. I hope there was some value. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. We're always willing to answer a few questions, take a little bit of time to answer whatever questions you might have around continuity, crisis management, threat and risk assessments, disaster recovery, to provide some of the information that we have. So please always don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. You've got my contact information there. That's my direct line, as well as my email address, or our website has all of that as well, and we're happy to do that. So we hope you have a great rest of the day, week, holiday period. And thank you for taking the time with us today.